So this resistance gives rise to different type of behavior within the organization, an unintended type of consequence that comes up within the organization, and something here being referred by Mayer, a theorist named Michael Mayer. Mayer says this gives rise to organization. Organization here refers to laws, rules and regulation. Let's say escape or weakening of control. Control and more organization, and this goes on. What is this organization, weakening of the control, more organization? In such type of situation within the organization, because since people, they become resistant, because since it is not in their interest, they resist the compliance. So in order to ensure more control over the subordinate, the managers bring in more laws, more regulations, more procedural control, and in turn the subordinate devise more strategies to escape, and in turn the managers or the employer bring in even more laws, more regulation, more control mechanism. So this is what gives rise to something called punishment-centered bureaucracy. This is an unintended consequence. So here Goldner's theory highlights that not necessarily within the Weberian style of bureaucracy there will be compliance towards laws, rules and regulation. Here he differs from Robert Merton. There could be a number of different types of behavior. One could comply, one may not comply, and in this, when the individual is not complying, the employer might punish, may not punish, employer might try to control, may not try to control. And whenever the employer tries to control the behavior of the subordinate, it gives rise to certain new phenomena. More rules and regulations come up, and it goes on. So organization becomes, organization acquires more laws, more rules, more regulations. So a few more aspects that Goldner has discussed is, let's see, in a punishment-centered bureaucracy, or mostly if you take into account the contemporary bureaucracy, it reflects this punishment-centered bureaucracy where the individuals within the organization, the functionaries within the organization, they have a tendency to escape the compliance, and within the organization, the superior, the employer, they have a tendency to ensure compliance, giving rise to what he refers to as punishment-centered bureaucracy. But see, as Alvin Goldner says, within the organization there is tensions. So within the organization there is tensions. Now what is this tensions? See, there is a primary tension, that is, on one account, the employer is dependent on the workers to help the employer achieve organizational goal or profit or efficiency, whatever that might be. So on one account, the employer is dependent on the workers within the organization to achieve the organizational goal. The second aspect is the employer has to control the behavior of the workers or the subordinates within the organization in order to achieve the goal. So this is a tension. On one account, he is dependent over the subordinates. In another context, has to control the subordinates. So this is the primary tension that exists within an organization. So in any organization, this is a type of tension that exists. On one account, the employers or the managers, they are dependent on the individuals within that organization to achieve the goal of that organization. On the second account, they are required to exercise control, or they have to control the behavior, the action, the activities of these subordinates. So this is the primary tension or contradiction that remains within the organization. But in order to resolve this primary tension, this is the primary tension. In order to resolve this primary tension, they have to enforce, or they have to apply laws, rules, regulation, or they have to introduce technical methods, processes, procedures. So all this, the very managing of the primary tension gives rise to what we say secondary tension. So primary, what is the primary tension? This very contradiction. Employer has to control. Like let's say if you are my subordinate, I am dependent on you to help me achieve my goal. But at the same time, I have to control you. I have to boss over you. So I am dependent, and at the same time I have to boss over you. This is a contradiction. This is a contradictory character that is very much there. And in this particular context, this tension, this particular tension that is there needs to be managed. So I have to control you, and at the same time I am dependent on you. I have to manage this particular tension. And how do I manage this? I manage this by bringing in, let's say, standardization to your job. I bringing in various laws, rules, regulation, mechanism, and enforcing the same over you. I try to manage it. So I try to manage the primary tension that is there through laws, rules, and regulation. So this itself gives rise to the secondary tension. The secondary tension is whether you will comply, you will not comply, to what extent you will comply. And as already he has discussed, the compliance to these laws, rules, and regulation depends on the varied interest of the categories, the employers and the employees, that is giving rise to different patterns of what you say bureaucracy, that is whether it's a mock bureaucracy, representative bureaucracy, or let's say the punishment centered bureaucracy. But see, with regard to this tension that is there within the organization, on one account already we have discussed, Alvin Goldner says that this very tension that is there, that in the enforcement of the laws, rules, and regulation, one possibility is the punishment centered bureaucracy. That is, people will resist, the workers will resist to the laws, rules, and regulation. They will try not to follow those rules and regulations, and thereby there will be something called a punishment centered bureaucracy. But interestingly, Goldner highlights another aspect to this resistance by the workers within the organization towards the laws, rules, and regulation, and this basically leading towards certain other consequences. Like in his discussion on bureaucratic indulgence pattern, bureaucratic indulgence pattern, he has highlighted another dimension to the reality of the organization, the laws, rules, regulations within the organization, and the compliance or the non-compliance of the individuals within the organization. Alvin Goldner in his study found out that not necessarily in every case of the resistance by the worker towards the laws, the employer will create more laws, rules or regulations. Let me repeat. So we have referred that in case people resist, workers resist, the control that is sought to be exercised by the manager, many a time it gives rise to punishment-centered bureaucracy. There is more laws, rules and regulations to control the workers. Goldner says in certain other cases, he is highlighting that it not necessarily in every case this non-conformity results into a punishment-centered bureaucracy. Rather, in number of cases, the managers they tend to ignore this violation. So he's saying, he found out that in number of cases, the managers tend to ignore the violations, even if the compliance to those laws remains in the interest of the managers. So in the initial study, he has found out that in case a law goes to the interest of the manager, but not necessarily to the interest of the worker tend to resist, worker tend to ignore, and when worker tend to ignore, the management try to impose more and more control, giving rise to a punishment-centered bureaucracy. But Golden himself highlights that not necessarily in all the cases that involves similar situation, gives rise to punishment-centered bureaucracy. Rather, in number of cases, it results into structural adaptation. Structural adaptation or even accommodation. Let me explain this through an example. See, let's say the workers during the work hour is taking rest or interacting with a fellow worker or having a tea break. That is not scheduled. That's not very much scheduled. So this is something in violation to the existing laws, rules or regulation within the organization. So this is not in the interest of the employer. But still, many a time, the managers used to indulge this particular behavior of the worker. They used to entertain this particular behavior of the worker because they do not want to create an unpleasant work environment. So that's what is indulgence pattern. So even if, let's say, that is not in the rule book, that you will go for a tea break, or you will chat with your colleague, or you will take some rest. See here, even if it is not in the interest of the manager, and the management would like that the individual should keep working, still the manager does not enforce this violation, will entertain this violation because they would not like to create an unpleasant work situation. At the same time, another aspect, this behavior of the manager is also somewhat rational. I am saying, even if, let's say, the worker is doing something that is not in the rule book, that is not in the interest of the managers, still the managers would allow it, will entertain it, will allow the worker to indulge in those activities. Why? One, They don't want to create unpleasant environment in the workplace, because more you will be very insistent. Don't go for tea break. Why did you go for a tea break? Why did you take rest? Keep working. So this may not be very pleasant, and it might result into a very unpleasant work environment. The second is their reaction not to intervene, not to actually punish, rather to allow this type of behavior is also rational. Rational means it has a purpose. What is the purpose? Because many a time, if the manager insists on this type of violation or take notes of this violation and tries to punish or control, then as a reaction, the worker might follow something called work by rule policy or approach. Work by rule policy or approach. Work by rule policy or approach, that means they would not be flexible. They would not engage in any other activity or any sort of activity that is not defined for them or preset for them, because on a number of occasions the manager or the supervisor would require the worker to carry out or take up an activity that is not exactly their officially defined activity. So if the manager does not show flexibility, the worker will also not show the same flexibility. So in order to ensure that the workers, they do not create an unpleasant work environment, and at the same time, at the time of the requirement, they remain flexible and help the manager also entertains such violation with regard to the compliance of the rule. So that is what is bureaucratic indulgence pattern, bureaucratic indulgence pattern.